2,700 years ago, in the heartlands of ancient China, and in a small kingdom in what is now Turkey, a revolutionary idea was born. And so began the fabulous story of money.
These first coins, if you were to compare them to a modern monetary unit, were not €1 coins, but bills of 500 euros, perhaps more.
In the West, it was a mixture of gold and silver. While in Asia, bronze coins were minted by the billions.
There are a lot of coins. There were no banks at the time, so people couldn't deposit their money anywhere and had to find somewhere to bury it.
Why did money spread all over the world? Was it for war or trade?
From a world where people didn't use money, it now circulated absolutely everywhere, including in the remotest areas.
From Alexander the Great to the heyday of Rome.
Gold drives one mad. Gold corrupts minds.
From the invention of paper money just 1,000 years ago in China.
It was a watershed event.
To the French Revolution and the Great Depression in the United States.
There was this idea that the gold standard was the cornerstone of civilization. Of course, that turned out to be totally wrong.
Discover how money changed the course of human history. In the 5th century BCE, Athens had dominated the Mediterranean. Its currency, the dram, had been the tool for its supremacy. But now it was a vanquished city. A new age had begun. This was the age of empires, of great predators who would use the money of others to fuel their expansion. This new page of history began with the adventures of one man, one of the greatest conquerors of all time, Alexander the Great, who would extend his empire as far as India.
Alexander the Great is one of the most well-known figures of the ancient world, because in a few short years, as the king of Macedonia, he conquered a vast empire, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. This conquest took him from Macedonia to Asia Minor, Egypt, the Near East, Iran, Persia, and all the way to India. What people often forget is that conquering the vast Achaemenid Persian Empire meant conquering its wealth. In Persepolis, in Babylon, Alexander seized the treasure amassed by the great Persian kings. Written sources put the figure at 180,000 talents. The talent was a Greek unit of weight. The problem is that although these sources mention the sum of 180,000 talents, they do not specify what they were composed of. They were in gold and silver, but we don't know in what proportions. If these 180,000 talents were made purely of gold, it would mean they had about 480 tons of gold.
tonnes d'or.
Well, if they were purely of silver, that's about 4,800 tons of silver.
Donc, des quantités.
So astronomical amounts.
According to ancient authors, 10,000 mules and 5,000 camels were needed to transport all of this treasure across the deserts of Persia. Treasure with which Alexander the Great minted his own coins by the tens of thousands to pay his armies following his conquests.
He died without heirs.
Il a
Despite this, he had successors who were known as the diadochi.
diadoikoi,
They were his generals, his officers.
des officiers.
Initially, these rivals kept up the fiction of the empire, but in reality, they fought for control of it almost immediately.
Se le partager. Et que font?
And what did these diadochi do?
Eh ben, ils
They
revendiquent
claimed
la
Alexander's
légitimité
legitimacy.
d'Alexandre.
Alexander's successors produced huge quantities of gold and silver coins to pay their armies. The same coins Alexander had issued before he died.
Et comme
And the consequence was that these Alexanders replaced, to some extent, everything that had previously
tout
existed.
ce qui existait avant. Ils vont être
There
tellement
were so
nombreux
many Alexanders that they became the referential currency, the currency in which everyone wanted to be paid. And a new monetary world came into being.
nouveau monde monétaire.
Alexander the Great founded 20 cities that bore his name. Alexandria in Egypt is no doubt the most well-known. The city fell into the hands of one of his generals, Ptolemy, who founded a new dynasty here. He and his successors would be incredible monetary innovators. This is Héloïse Aumetre, an expert on the money of the time. She's working with the scientists of the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, run by Franck Godiot. The team is carrying out excavations at two different sites some 20 kilometers apart, Alexandria and Tonis Heraklion, where there are the remains of the city-state's two ancient ports.
We're in the vast eastern bay of Alexandria, and in ancient times, this was the location of Portus Magnus, one of the largest ports in Mediterranean antiquity. A series of cataclysmic events completely destroyed the Portus Magnus, which was totally submerged underwater. For an archaeologist, what's even better is that some of these events hurled buildings which were on dry land into the ports. It was impossible to salvage them at the time, and so we're lucky enough to be able to explore these monuments now. We come across absolutely huge quantities of coins every year. It's quite something. We find them in the position in which they fell next to one another, sometimes even with their small containers. A small wooden box, for instance. Or we make out a purse because we can see the form the small hoard of coins took when it was buried in the sediment.
I found 2 coins.
Ok.
OK, great. They're Ptolemaic. Layer 4?
Layer 4.
They're a bit bloated, but once they're restored, the details will be visible. Great, we'll record them.
As soon as the coins are brought aboard, they're immersed in a tank of fresh water to gradually remove the salt from them. To the rear of the boat, Héloïse Aumaitre can now examine them for the first time.
They've been submerged for about 2,300 years, so the metal has reacted with the salt and all the different materials with which these coins were buried. And so you get this build-up of corrosion on them, which, unfortunately, in this instance, means we can't decipher them. But what I can say is, this coin was issued in Alexandria by the Ptolemies between 260 and the beginning of the 2nd century BCE. The majority of coins we find are bronze, but we do find gold coins too. And gold coins do not corrode in seawater. They're in the same condition as they were when lost, which means they can immediately be identified. So when we find them, and they're perfectly legible too, it's always a bit of an event for everyone on board.
In Alexandria, where the scientists store their finds, bronze is the rule, gold and silver the exception. And for good reason. These coins relate a crucial chapter in the history of money when, in the Mediterranean, its use spread throughout society. Tens of thousands of coins found in Alexandria and Thonis Heracleion are kept here. Once restored, they look brand new.
Ptolemy II Philadelphus made reforms. He introduced a new taxation system and the obligation that some of these taxes be paid in bronze coins. So what happened? Bronze coinage made its way into every household. And to provide them with the means to pay these taxes, Ptolemy had to mint a truly impressive amount of money, from the smallest denomination coin to the largest, in order to introduce all of this money into daily life, to enable everyone to have access to it. So, from a world where people didn't use money, it now circulated absolutely everywhere, including in the remotest areas. The state created a need, the state supplied the money to meet this need, and that is how bronze coinage conquered Egypt. The value of a coin such as this was significant. It was a form of fiat money, money whose value is decided by the state. Gold and silver are precious metals, so they're valuable because of the very nature of their metal. Whereas the value of these bronze coins depended on the device, or type, stamped on them. So it was the state that decided a coin's value. And users had to trust the state and say, right, this object has the value the state has given it. It's like a banknote today. After all, what's a banknote? Just a piece of paper. But we trust the fact that it's a bill worth €100 and not simply a piece of paper we can rip, because the state has printed its value on it.
Unlike a gold or silver coin, if you melt down a bronze coin, the metal obtained is worth much less than the original coin. The state pocketed the difference. In Alexandria, for the first time ever, this was done on a massive scale. Each coin featured the king, or the royal couple, or the king's wife. Circulating as it did in society, money also became a propaganda tool. It's possible to read the entire history of the dynasty on these coins, right up to the famous Cleopatra VII, who took her own life in 30 BCE following her defeat by the Romans. In the ruins of the port of Alexandria, the archaeologists have found the coins of its victor. Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The man who brought the Ptolemaic dynasty to an end after 3 centuries' rule over Egypt. At the time, the Roman Empire was expanding its control over the whole of the Mediterranean, and coinage was one of its first tools for expansion. And yet, Rome had neither gold nor silver initially. Nothing suggested it would become what it did, a military as well as a monetary superpower.
The Romans adopted coinage much later than the Greeks. Around 300 BCE, they began to produce 2 types of coins at the same time.
Precious metal coins, minted in very small numbers, for trade with abroad. And above all, bronze coins for everyday transactions.
They are large bronze coins cast in molds, ingots, and large round pieces. And what's really spectacular is the imagery. On the very big ingots, which are rarities and practically the largest known units of bronze in the ancient world, they put cows on them. Why? Because the first name for money in Latin, pecunia, comes from pecus, meaning cattle, a herd of cattle. This was because the first form of wealth, as early as the Bronze Age, were animals. And they made an equivalence between the value of animals, of herds, and the weighed bronze. There were no gold or silver mines in Italy, so precious metals, silver, then gold, had to come from abroad.
How did Rome find the gold and silver it needed to fuel its empire? Through war, according to the authors of antiquity. Starting with the wars against Carthage, the so-called Punic Wars, which began in 264 BCE in Sicily. Carthage was then the major power in the Western Mediterranean. But Rome proved more resilient and eventually triumphed.
It was a war which, already in antiquity, was considered a long war. Almost 25 years of intense fighting, which cost a huge amount. And at the end, the 2 city-states found themselves in serious financial difficulty. Obviously, the city-state in most difficulty was Carthage. Why? Because it had lost. And Rome imposed war reparations on it. These amounted to 4,400 talents of silver, the equivalent of over 100 tons of silver. This considerable sum had to be paid over 10 years.
Most of the huge tribute paid by Carthage to Rome was stored in the basement of the Temple of Saturn.
There were large quantities of metals, most of which were in the forms of ingots, bronze ingots as well as ingots of precious metals. But there were coins too, of course. It's also conceivable there were manufactured items, tableware, gold and silverware, which had a considerable value.
For 20 years, Rome simply stored the treasure from the First Punic War against Carthage. Perhaps it suspected that its enemy would seek revenge, which it did in 218 BCE, when the Carthaginian general Hannibal invaded Italy. At the Battle of Cannae, his armies annihilated the Roman legions. Hannibal now held Rome's future in his hands. The city's riches were moved to the temple of Juno Moneta, next to which was its monetary works. Because of this, moneta came to mean money. Here, the Romans produced a new gold coin featuring Mars, the god of war, and a silver coin, the denarius, depicting Roma, the warrior goddess. This coinage would enable Rome to rebuild its armies and reverse the balance of power. 20 years later, it had control of all of Carthage's territories. Did Rome defeat Carthage thanks to the tribute exacted from its enemy? Here in Orléans, scientists are looking for proof of this. Today in the Archaeomaterials Research Institute labs, they are analysing one of the gold coins seized by Rome following its victory against Carthage in 241 BCE.
The obverse of the coin bears the head of a female deity wearing 2 ears of corn, 2 earrings, and a necklace. And this became Carthage's most common monetary symbol.
Placed next to it is a Roman coin minted during the Second War against Carthage, when Rome drew on its precious metal reserves to produce new coins. Both are analysed with a mass spectrometer, an instrument which identifies each of the particles present in the coin's metal.
What you can see here on the screen is a microsample obtained with laser ablation. In other words, a tiny amount of material is taken from these coins, but nevertheless a sufficient amount, to enable us to characterize its composition.
Metals that the ancients considered pure actually always contain impurities, residual impurities, which is fortunate for us. These small impurities are a godsend for us archaeometallurgists because they tell us something about where the metal came from.
Many analyses of this type have been conducted in Orléans on gold coins from Rome and Carthage. And similar amounts of the same impurities found in their composition.
The gold used to produce the Carthaginian coins of the First Punic War had a signature also found in Roman gold. as if these considerable quantities of metals had been seized in Sicily, transported to Rome, stored in the treasury, and then converted into gold coins when the need arose.
A war, a victory, the seizure of considerable amounts of gold and silver, which were used to finance a new war and a new victory. From then on, this was how the empire functioned.
The expansion of the Republic, of the Imperium Romanum, the Empire of the Romans, that is, the area Rome controlled, resulted, thanks to wars won, thanks to spoils, in a flood of metal, much of which could be used to produce coinage.
Julius Caesar continued his campaign of plundering and predation when he captured Gaul and northern Hispania. At each stage of his conquests, he seized significant amounts of gold and silver coins. But a few Gallic tribes managed to hurriedly hide their treasure. This is what happened on the island of Jersey, where two amateur metal detectorists discovered an extraordinary Celtic coin hoard in 2012.
Together with my friend Reg Mead, I remember coming here in early January 2012, and not too far from where we are now, there was the first coin.
One day I'm in the field with Richard when I looked up and there he was holding his hand up in front of him. And he just said, "Got one." And that was when the story of the hoard really took off. So I rocked the spade in the ground, and right at the last minute, it's like when you scratch a fork on a plate. It's that ee sound.
So I just shouted, "Hoard, Reg, we found a hoard." We thought we were going to find a pot or a container, if we were lucky, of these coins. Well, at the end of the first day, we hadn't even hit the edge of these coins. There was just a mass of green, mushy peas of corroded coins. It was just a mass of them.
And we had to get a crane to come along and lift it out. And it was roughly about 3/4 of a ton of gold and silver, which later we found to be the largest Celtic Iron Age coin hoard ever found in the world.
It took 3 years to separate each of the coins from this mass of corroded metal. Also found amid the coins were all sorts of jewellery, including these Celtic torques, twisted gold collars worn by warriors in recognition of their valour.
There we are. Every year, so for 12 years, we still find the occasional one. So it's worth coming back time and time again. One Armorican coin.
Part of the hoard is now on display at the Jersey Museum. But the bulk of it, tens of thousands of silver coins, is kept in the museum's stores.
We have a current figure of 69,347 coins.
The great majority, about 95% of the coins in the hoard, are issues of the Koreos Elite. The next biggest group is the Ossismi, who occupied Finisterre and a little bit of the Côte d'Amour, And then there are just a few coins from other Armorican tribes.
I think the biggest question is just why is this so huge? Why are there so many coins here? It is 5 or 6 times bigger than any other Celtic hoard treasure that has ever been found.
I think the most likely scenario is all this material coming probably from Brittany, and it's probably come just ahead of Julius Caesar's troops moving into Armorican Gaul in 56 BC. And they've gathered up really absolutely everything that they owned in precious metal. And then they've presumably brought it across the sea from Brittany, and they must have friends, political allies, probably relations with people who lived on Jersey. Jersey is pro-Celtic. It's still a safe haven for the Celtic tribes, visible on the horizon from France. I don't think Julius Caesar really paid a lot of attention to what was going on here. The island is simply too far away, too small and inconsequential in many ways to Julius Caesar to worry about.
Although the Jersey hoard escaped his clutches, in Gaul, Julius Caesar carried off considerable amounts of gold jewelry and coins. So much, in fact, that when his huge spoils arrived in Rome, the value of this precious metal is said to have dropped by 20%.
Caesar plundered the entire Mediterranean basin. The Roman historian Cassius Dio wrote that Julius Caesar was a man who knew how to make money and amass it. We regard Caesar as a great war leader, which he was, and he was recognized as such in antiquity. But he was also recognized as someone who knew how to find resources. The composition of Caesar's gold was analyzed, and unlike what has been observed in earlier Roman gold, a new elementary signature appeared. This signature in Caesar's gold, which has never previously been seen in Roman coinage, matches some of the signatures observed when analyzing Gallic gold. So what the written sources tell us has actually been confirmed thanks to archaeometry, thanks to analysis. We read the same thing in the coins as in these ancient texts.
The Roman Empire was a formidable machine which devoured all the treasure in its path and used it to finance subsequent conquests. After Caesar, it was Augustus's turn. He seized the vast treasure of Ptolemaic Egypt in 30 BCE. But he didn't stop there. Augustus also organized the systematic exploitation of the countries he conquered, taking predation to an unprecedented level.
Check map to confirm.
You might think that these mountains were shaped by the forces of nature, wind, rain, and streams. But they were fashioned by humankind, generations of inhabitants of this region in the northwest Iberian Peninsula.
We have found hundreds of gold mines all over this area. It is one of the regions where the Roman Empire extracted the most gold.
Mining operations in Las Medullas, as in all the mines in this area, began in Augustus's reign. They continued for about 200 years.
To understand mines, like those of Las Medullas, we need to take a bird's eye view. And for this, LiDAR has proved invaluable. LiDAR is a remote sensing technology that generates extremely accurate, high-resolution topographic images which enable us to see each and every detail of the landscape. We have identified some 800 kilometers of water networks used for mining operations here. It's absolutely colossal. We can also see in detail the different reservoirs where the water used to operate the mine was stored.
50 kilometers away, the Las Omañas mines offer another type of landscape. Here, the land was literally combed. Each of these lines is a canal that once sluiced the ore.
What we can see is a completely modified, completely humanized landscape with almost perfectly geometric forms, which show the Roman Empire's impact on the landscape. Studies show that the average gold extraction rate was about 0.05 grams per cubic meter of ore. It's a very small quantity. But for the Roman world, it was crucial, as gold played a very important role in its economy, in its imperial plan, and above all, in its monetary policy. In today's way of thinking, we would definitely consider it unprofitable. No company today would be interested in the gold of Las Medullas.
What wouldn't be profitable today most certainly was during the Roman Empire. Quite simply because labor cost nothing. The miners were not slaves, but local peasants who, generation after generation, paid in kind the taxes they owed the empire.
A slave had to be fed, lodged, and cared for. So slave labor was far more expensive than free labor, such as that of the peasants who worked here and who paid their tribute to the Roman Empire through their work, their labor.
But at the beginning of the 3rd century CE, everything changed. With barbarian invasions and inflation, one after the other, across the empire, the gold and silver mines were abandoned. At the same time, Rome's expansion came to a halt. It could no longer tap the wealth of conquered countries, and its army now cost far more than it brought in. For its silver currency, the pillar of its monetary system, it was the beginning of the end.
The flow of money is like the flow of blood. You have to ensure there is always sufficient liquidity in the system. However, money is gradually lost. It gets lost in single units. People lose coins, or they hoard them somewhere, and they're never recovered during wars and troubles. And so, for a money circuit to function properly, new metal has to be added periodically. When sources of money dry up, there comes a time when the amount of metal available is no longer sufficient to meet the needs of the budget, and of the military budget in particular.
The Roman Empire was in a state of crisis. Invasions, civil wars, the virtuous circle, which had made Rome's currency so strong, became a vicious circle. More and more coins were produced to pay the armies, but the amount of precious metal in each coin decreased until it disappeared altogether. In a matter of decades, the beautiful Roman coins lost most of their value, and the entire system almost collapsed.
The height of the political, economic, military, security and monetary crisis of the 3rd century CE occurred in the 270s. As well as widespread insecurity, several dozen cities were destroyed in Gaul, chiefly in northern Gaul. So this period was the period of maximum coin hoarding in antiquity. In other words, people buried their savings, buried the coins they had amassed, and then fled. And if we're finding these hoards today, it's simply because their owners did not come back for them. Here we have just a small part of one of the largest hoards of this period. The Évreux hoard, which was found in the 19th century, comprises 100,000 coins and is eloquent testimony, so to speak, of Roman monetary deterioration at the time. When you look at them, you can see they're made of copper. They contain no silver. Also, they weigh very little, 1.5 grams, 2 grams, 2.2 grams. Whereas 40 years prior, or even less, these coins weighed over 5 grams and were 50% silver. Between the 230s and the 280s, 90% of the pure silver found in imperial coinage disappeared, never to be seen again.
Coins were now worthless, and prices rose to unprecedented levels. Emperor Diocletian took a now famous decision: the Edict on Maximum Prices. In 301 CE, he erected stelae inscribed with the text all over the empire. In Greece, in a village in the Peloponnese, they were reused for the front of this small church. The Edict on Prices set maximum prices and wages for all goods and services. A day's work, a haircut, the price of cereals and meat. Everything was regulated. And if the ceiling was not respected, profiteers risked the death penalty. But it was no good. The threat was not sufficiently dissuasive, and price controls were swiftly abandoned. The Roman Empire was at a dead end. But there was a solution. Gold coins, the coins of the elite, had remained pure. Unlike silver coins, they hadn't been mixed with a less precious metal. In 310 CE, when Constantine became emperor, he made the gold coin the keystone of his new monetary system.
Constantine created a new gold coin called the solidus. In Latin, solidus meant stable, something you can depend on. In Old French, the solidus coin was contracted to sol, which in modern French became sou. So the origin of the word sou for money is Constantine's new gold coin. The new gold coin had a pure composition and a stable weight. It was the coinage of the empire's ruling classes, the emperor, his family, high-ranking officials, army generals and big landowners. However, the masses, the citizens and peasants, the poor people in society, had no access to gold.
However, Constantine demanded that every citizen in the empire pay tax, either in gold or in silver. Silver being extremely rare, the only way to pay was in gold.
People needed a money changer, a banker if they were in the city, but in the countryside, a rich landowner. He would pay a gold coin to the state for them as an advance. But they had to pay him back. And if they couldn't pay him back, they were indebted to him. And the only way for them to pay back their debt was through work. And they had to work more and more to make up for the money they owed. And so a system was established in which free peasants were forced into a position where they were increasingly dependent on those who owned gold.
Constantine's monetary system lasted a long time after the fall of the Roman Empire. It survived the first barbarian invasions and their first kingdoms for around 3 centuries.
Gradually, these kingdoms would experience the same problem with gold as there had been with silver 300 years beforehand. Namely, the gold reserves would dry up. So at some point, gold was replaced by silver.
This new silver coin, called the denier, appeared, the currency of a new emperor, Charlemagne. The raw material came from the Mel mines, which in the 8th century were operating at full capacity and would provide the Carolingian Empire with the means to realize its ambitions. How did the Mel mines work? And why were they eventually abandoned? Florent Terrigeul, an expert on ancient metallurgy, is able to provide answers thanks to his study of the practices of medieval miners.
You can clearly hear it fracturing. It's a very ancient method dating from the proto-historic period. You build a fire against a rock face to heat the stone, and the heat causes the stone to dilate and fracture.
This technique is known as fire setting. It produced these very distinctive forms, which resemble natural caves rather than man-made mines. They're the result of some 500 years of extraction.
Here's a beautiful piece. This ore is galena, a lead sulfide, which contains the few thousandths of silver that the Carolingian miners were after.
The silver extracted from the Mel mines was used to produce Charlemagne's deniers. In the early 9th century, several million of these coins, weighing just under 2 grams, were produced every year.
When an archaeologist comes across a Carolingian coin, there's a 50% chance it will bear the inscription Mel, because it appears that people had confidence in this coinage made of raw silver extracted and produced in Mel. So when you had a coin from Mel, you had a genuine silver coin.
Smelting produces what is known as lead bullion. Each kilo contains just under 1 gram of silver.
Once all this lead had been collected, you move on to the refining stage. This consists in building another fire and heating the lead bullion to a temperature of around 1,000 degrees Celsius.
Air must be blown over the molten material continuously for several dozen minutes. Then, all of a sudden, beads of silver form.
At a rough guess, I'd say this weighs about 12 grams, which corresponds to about 100 kilos of extracted rock. If you burn 100 kilos of wood, you obtain 10 kilos of galena. And from these 10 kilos of galena, you obtain 10 to 20 grams of silver. So this shows just how important wood fuel was in these mines. In the first centuries, everything went well. They burned 80 to 90% beech. So there must have been a beech forest nearby that was used for the mines. In the 10th century, there appears to have been increased demand for silver. And to increase production, the only solution was to burn more wood. A decrease in the use of beech was witnessed at this point, and oak as well as some chestnut were burnt instead. The problem with oak is that it takes a very long time to grow, whereas beech can be cut every 20 years. When you start burning oak in mines, you're essentially burning down your forest. The forest is not sustained, and wooded parcels disappear as a result. In time, there was no more beech, and oak had all but disappeared too. So it would appear that this overconsumption, this desire to produce more, actually had the opposite effect. We know that around the year 1000, mining ceased here.
But the closure of the Mel mines did not mean the minting of Carolingian coins came to an abrupt halt. Initially, old coins were melted down to produce new coins. But silver became increasingly rare, and the denier lost much of its value. At the same time, just as the Mel mines were closing, the empire of Charlemagne, who saw himself as the successor of Rome, gradually fragmented. The vast unified empire gave way to a very large number of fiefdoms, between which trade was less intense. All of this occurred at the very moment when, on the other side of the world, coins were being minted by the billions, and paper money made its first appearance.